Hello again, hockey fans, and welcome to part 2 of this episode of Anatomy of a Season covering the 1992-93 Montreal Canadiens. If you haven't checked out the first video in this series, looking at their regular season month by month, please check it out. It would now focus on the playoffs, but I recommend that you watch that first video right now. But awaiting them in the first round were their heated rivals, the Quebec Nordiques, as the playoffs were still under a divisional format, and this would actually be the last year for it. The Habs held off the Nordiques most of the season, minus a brief period going into the new year, where they held first place most of the season, but they faltered in March as well as April, and slipped all the way to third place for 102 points behind Quebec's 104. The Boston Bruins went on a huge hot streak to finish the year, and finished in first place. At the beginning of the year, the Habs, during the preseason, had the odds makers betting them at 7th best chance of winning the Stanley Cup, while the Nordiques were tied for 17th in the league in those preseason odds, meaning many felt that they wouldn't make the playoffs, but would still be better than they'd been in recent years. It was the rubber match of the Battle of Quebec, as the first series in 1982 saw the Nords win it in a huge upset in the best-of-5 series in Game 5 from a Dale Hunter overtime goal. In 1984, it was the Habs' turn to pull off an upset, culminating in the infamous Game 6 Good Friday Massacre. A year later, it was overtime in Game 7, and Peter Stastny scored the win for the Nordiques, taking them to the conference final. And then in 1987, it was another tough 7-game outing again, only this time the Habs were the victors. Despite the early odds makers' predictions, not many pundits and experts were giving Montreal much of a chance here to win this series. And the Nordiques, after 5 excruciating seasons being pretty much the laughingstock of the NHL, had finally built into a contender. Those terrible years gave them good draft picks such as Joe Sakic and Matt Sundin, who both had 100-point seasons. Owen Nolan was starting to break out. They had also drafted Eric Lindros, who of course did not want to play for the team, so they traded him and got Mike Ricci, and also a top-notch defenseman in Steve Desjardins, and star goaltender Ron Hextall. Game 1 was set to take place in Le Colisée on April 18, 1993. Patrick Roy in net for the Habs, Ron Hextall in net for the Nordiques. And just over 5 minutes in, Gilbert Dion scores to put the Habs on the board first. Roy is great in net, but so is Hextall, refusing to give anything up. We go to midway in the second period, where Brian Bellows, the Habs' big offseason acquisition, scores a power play goal set up by none other than Kirk Muller. And Montreal carries a 2-0 lead into the third period. The game seems well in hand for the Habs. They're just less than 2 minutes away from taking Game 1. Glorious day, and a goal by Martin Raczynski on the power play still keeps the Nords alive. Well, all the Habs have to do now is hold on. Sakic. Sakic scores with 48 seconds to play. 2 goals in 41 seconds, and Roy is not happy. And neither is head coach Jacques Demers. We're off to OT, and it's exciting as ever. Roy and Hextall are superb, but Steve Desjardins begins a play that allows Mike Ricci to go ahead and set up Scott Young to score the overtime winner. With just 3:11 remaining in the extra frame, the Habs drop a heartbreaking Game 1. Indeed, the media is all over the Habs for this one, mainly Patrick Roy for letting in those late goals. It's a 3-2 win and a huge team effort from the Nords to pull off such a major comeback. Game 2, the Habs' spirits were clearly destroyed, and even though Patrick Roy apparently made the vow to never let another overtime goal in as long as they're in these playoffs, ring true in Game 2. Unfortunately, that's because the Nordiques go up 3-0 in the first period, and Hextall is brilliant in net. Bellows gets them on the board midway through the third, but it's hardly enough. Claude Lapointe, who's having a really good series so far, nets the empty netter to make it a 4-1 final. The Habs are abysmal, and again the critics are out to play, again targeting Roy, despite the fact that defense played miserably in this game, as Rob Ramage has lent nothing to the series, or for that matter this team, all that much since arriving. Not to mention neither Vincent Dawfus or Denis Savard have registered anything in the first 2 games, while Bellows is providing more of the offense, it seems. There's a lot of stories going into Game 3, as again the goaltender controversy, mainly created by the Montreal sports media, rises to the surface. But Demers assures Roy that he's his guy going forward and still has faith in him, as the series shifts to the Montreal Forum for Game 3. Montreal needs their big guns up front to deliver, their defense to get meaner, and their checkers to hit harder. But also the Nordiques are just playing good hockey. Scott Young and Claude Lapointe are outstanding. Hextall is brilliant in net. Desjardins doing his thing on the blue line. Ricci providing tons of grit. And while Sakic, Sundin, and Nolan are aren't really necessarily delivering explosive numbers, they're still hustling for that puck and getting good opportunities. Game 3, however, is tense, but the crowd at the Forum is rabid. much like they are for many games featuring these two teams, and Sundin scores just over a minute in and silences them pretty fast. Hextall again is doing his thing in net, but just over a minute into the second period, the line of Dawfus, Bellows, and Muller come alive as the latter of the three scores his first goal of the series, and the game is tied. Both teams push, but the goalies push back, as Hextall is pretty much being bombarded while Waugh is forced to make some huge saves, as the rest of the second period and all of the third period solves nothing. It's now time for overtime. Will Waugh live up to his promise and not let another overtime goal in? He comes up big in the extra frame, and while every Habs fan is watching on the edge of their seat, Bellows sets up Vincent Dawfus, who halfway in gets his first goal of the playoffs, and surprise, surprise, it's a game winner. Jubilation at the Forum, and for Habs fans all over, they are still in this thing. A great clutch performance. Dawfus finally breaks out. Waugh is hot in net, and Bellows plays another beauty of a game, and now the Habs have momentum to try and tie the series in Game 4. And indeed, the Habs have a whole new confidence in that very game, and Quebec needs a big game from their quiet big guns this time if they want to take control of this series. On the power play, just 5 minutes in, Dawfus picks up where he left off in Game 3. With a big goal to open the game and spread joy in the fabled farm. However, Scott Young, arguably the MVP for Quebec in this series though so far, ties the game with just about 4 minutes later. It is tied 1-1 after one period. Things are quiet until Gary Lehman scores his first goal of the playoffs midway through the second period. With just over 2 minutes left in the second, Sakic scores another big game. We are tied 2-2 after 2. But it literally takes just over a minute into the final period for Benoit Brunet to give the Habs their lead back, and Waugh kept them in all the way the rest of the way. The defense was able to give him some breathing room as well. And the Habs hold on for a huge 3-2 win, a great team effort, whereas the defense played their best game of the series so far. And speaking of the series, it is now tied 2-2 as we head to Quebec. It's hard to believe that the Habs back in Game 3 were just one OT goal away from going down 3 games to none in this series, but now we're tied up for an all-important Game 5. In a series like this game could be the game changer to shift all momentum to one side. The big guns on both sides will need to come out firing. And it's grinder Mike Keane, however, who opens the scoring early in the first period. And Waugh and the Habs are keeping Quebec off the score sheet. And the first period ends with Montreal up 1-0. However, early in the second, Andrei Kovalenko ties it for the Nordiques. It's more bad news for the Habs as Waugh takes a brutal shot to his clavicle area, and he has to leave the game. Truly could hear the gasps of Montreal fans everywhere all across the country, including 10-year-old yours truly. Andre Rasico enters the game, and the defense does tighten up for the goalie who has no real playoff experience. But it's not enough as Matt Sundin scores on a power play to give the Nordiques the lead. But not even 3 minutes later, Bellows and Dawfus team up to tie the game, with the latter scoring when it matters clearly like he's known to do, and the game is tied 2-2. Late in the period, Dawfus followed that goal up by setting up the puck for Eric Desjardins to score, and Montreal leads 3-2, but just a mere 20 seconds later, Owen Nolan scores, and the game is again tied, this time at 3-3, and that's how it ends after 2 periods. But Montreal gets a big surprise. Patrick Watt, freezing his collarbone clavicle area, is back in the game, and Demers remembers his promise again, puts his faith in his ace. However, Sundin gets his second of the game, and the pressure cooker is on, and the Habs are the one facing it. But the team remains cool, calm, and collected, and responds as Gilbert Dion scores with just over 6.5 minutes to play, and the game is tied 4-4, and oh yes, we are headed to overtime. I should mention this game somewhat resembled the old battles of Quebec with many penalties and scuffles. But in overtime, the Habs can't get any rushes going, and the Quebec defense is playing a big game, with some tight checking from their grinders. Waugh's doing everything he can in his might to hold Montreal in this thing, and then Dawfus to Muller. That's it! Haha! Just one shot was all it took over 8 minutes in, and indeed after a terrible start, the Habs are in control of this series, heading back home for Game 6. It's another huge team effort with Dawfus, Muller, and Waugh, the standout performers on this night, while Desjardins and Dion also come up big in this 5-4 win. Now we're back at the Forum for Game 6, and Waugh's ready to go despite questions of his health, and the Habs are ready to ice this thing, while the Nordiques just don't seem to have an answer for what has been an epic tight-knit series thus far. But this one is anything but, as an unlikely source is the hero of this clinching game. Paul DiPietro, who has only had 1 assist in this whole series, fires off not 1, not 2, but 3 goals for the natural hat trick. Mike Keane has 3 assists on the night, and the Habs dominate Quebec 6-2 and win the series 4-2. They are off to the Adams Division Finals for the 10th straight season. Captain Guy Carbonneau has been there for every one of them. It started out badly for the Habs, but ended huge, as the team slowly came together as one and eliminated their heated rivals in what would end up being the final playoff series they would square off in, as 2 years later, the North would become the Avs and move to Colorado. The first 2 games were a disaster, but Montreal really showed a great deal of tenacity and resilience to come up in the clutch to win this one, silencing their critics, at least for now. Vincent Dawfus, after a slow start in this series and some criticism, broke out after he had a huge performance in Game 3, came through for the Habs, while Brian Bellows also had a really good series with 6 points. Muller, Dion, DiPietro, and Desjardins were all tied with 5 points. In the plus-minus, it's no surprise Lyle Odeline leads the way with +6, while Desjardins had a good series all in all, led all defensemen scoring with 5 points. It should be noted that Matthew Schneider missed all but 1 game in this series. That's not so good for the Habs, as Rob Ramage did eventually provide some aggression, but overall, it was these 2 who were depended on the most. Waz's numbers are outstanding, a big goals against average of 2.23 and a 9.36 save percentage, not to mention overcoming criticism and injury to shine in a huge way, as Rasico's numbers don't look great, but he only played 10 minutes. Montreal's opponent in the second round wasn't one many expected. The Buffalo Sabres, who in the first round pulled off a monster upset, not only beating but sweeping the first-place Boston Bruins. The Bruins, who ended their season on an 8-game winning streak, were unseated by a team who ended the year on a 7-game losing streak. They had a strong core of talent, however, as they had the second leading scorer in the league, the amazing Pat LaFontaine, or shall I say, LaFontaine. I always wanted to do that. They also had the man tied for leading goals in the league, Alexander McGillney, the great Dale Hawerchuk, a defense led by veteran Doug Bodger and former Hab, Peter Svoboda. In net, you had 2 amazing netminders in Dominic Hasek and Grant Fuhr. However, with Fuhr's vast playoff experience and 5 Stanley Cup rings, he was the guy to go to. Game 1 of the series was to kick off in Montreal on May 2nd, 1993. Waugh versus Fuhr. It's a playoff dream match. The Habs opened up the scoring early on in Game 1 with a power play goal from Benoit Brunet, but literally a minute later, LaFontaine and McGillney team up with the latter scoring to tie the game. But with 3.5 minutes to play in the first, Kirk Muller also scores on the power play. The Habs regain their lead, it's 2-1 after 1. In the second period, Paul DiPietro continues his momentum, scoring to give them a 2-goal lead. But then Dale Hawerchuk strikes on a power play, and then sets up Donald Audette 2.5 minutes later to tie the game 3-3 after 2 periods. But in the third period, Vincent Dongfu scores to give them a lead 4-3, and Patrick Waugh holds them in the rest of the way. Dongfu has another game winner, and they walk away with a 4-3 win to take Game 1. It's Mike Keane who has the big game, however, with 3 assists. As wherever he's seen to put the puck on that night, magic happened, and the results paid dividends for the Habs. Game 2 again from the Forum, and again the Habs open the scoring on the power play, and Vincent Dongfu scores an unassisted goal. But just 28 seconds later, Ken Sutton scores, and the game is tied at 1-1. And then on a power play of their own, Pat LaFontaine scores late in the frame to give the Sabres a 2-1 lead at intermission. Montreal, however, strikes again on the power play in the second period when Kirk Muller scores to tie the game. Then the line of Savard, Muller, and Dongfu ends with Vinny scoring the goal, his second of the game. Montreal leads 3-2 after 2. However, 44 seconds into the third period, Doug Bodger scores, and the rest of the way both Waugh and Fuhr make some huge saves, keeping their teams in the game. And yes, we are headed to overtime. I'm noticing a trend here. It does not take very long, however. It's just under 3 minutes in, Guy Carbonneau scores his first goal of the playoffs to give Montreal the 4-3 win as they take both games at home. Savard plays his best game of the playoffs so far, but captain consistency, Vincent Dawfus, still scoring all those important goals, while Waugh continues to shine in net. As the Montreal defense does struggle slightly, the series shifts to Buffalo, and the Sabres, thus far, have seen their big guns produced, but the Habs are just slightly better, as they threaten to take a commanding series lead in Game 3. The Habs also get a huge boost going into Game 3 as Brian Bellows, after missing the first 2 games, returns to the lineup, and the Habs strike early as 14 seconds in Kirk Muller scores to open things up. Bellows in his return sets up Dawfus, who has been red hot in this series, and the Habs now have a 2-0 lead. And it stays that way after the first period. But after Waugh had been turning several shots away, the Sabres finally got one. Ken Sutton scores deep into the second period, while Doug Bodger is the one who ties on a power play just over 2 minutes later. And not even 2 minutes into the third period, Guy Carbonneau scores a shorthanded goal to give Montreal the lead. However, midway through the frame, Dale Hawerchuk ties it again. And again, the goalies are pushing back, and we are headed to, another overtime. Waugh is amazing in net once again. And due to that, someone responds. And on this night, it's Gilbert Dions who scores the overtime winner just over 8 minutes in. Montreal takes a huge 3-0 series lead, and it could go for the sweep. Bellows was excellent upon his return, while Eric Desjardins played a big game as well. And once again, Patrick Waugh was turning away some big shots and goal opportunities. While the Sabres, Hawerchuk and LaFontaine were on point, McGillney, however, was shut down by Mike Keane, who was having a great series himself. In Game 4, the Habs were poised to take the sweep, but the Sabres were up for a fight and were not quitters. All 3 games have been tight back and forth, making for some awesome hockey, but the Sabres would be without McGillney and LaFontaine. It was looking bleak. Waugh was turning away everything, yet so was Fuhr. But Buffalo struck first blood this time as Ken Sutton, who was having a really good series, scored to make it 1-0 Sabres. However, just under 3 minutes later, Lyle Odeline scores his first goal of the playoffs to tie at 1-1, and that's how it would remain after 1. Vincent Dawfus continued to wreak havoc in his scoring streak in the second period to give Montreal a 2-1 lead. And then Kevin Haller scored his first goal of the playoffs, and it's 3-1 Montreal after 2. The time is winding down, but with 7:30 to play, Hawerchuk scores to wake up the fans of the odd. But the time is ticking in the final minute. Montreal's about to sweep, but yet again, the Sabres' resolve will not be destroyed. Yuri Milev scores with just 10 seconds to play. The auditorium erupts as they believe in their team yet, and yes, for the third straight game, we are off to overtime. Both teams have big chances, but cannot get anything past the star goaltenders. But once again, it's Waugh with his clutch saves in the net that causes his team to respond in turn, as Kirk Muller puts the series on ice with his second overtime goal of the playoffs. And for the first time since 1989, the Habs will play in the Wales Conference Finals. They have won 8 straight games and have won the last 5 games that have gone into overtime. The clutch play of this team is something that fans are taking notice of. And when you have clutch performers like Dawfus and Muller on your club, it's a big difference maker. But when you have Mike Keane defending up against top forwards, it also helps your cause. And of course, sensational clutch goaltending from Patrick Waugh. Dawfus was on fire with some huge goals in this series, while Kirk Muller's clutch play was becoming a key factor for this Habs team as well. Mike Keane was incredible at containing McGillney and also adding 5 assists to his tally. In terms of plus-minus, Patrice Brisebois was coming through for the Habs in the playoffs, with the team leading +5 in this series, while in terms of defensemen scoring, Haller and Desjardins, who both played excellently, had 3 points each. In goal, Patrick Waugh in a word was brilliant. His numbers were up slightly from the Nordique series, but it was his play in overtime that helped Montreal pour through, reliving those days he superbly played in the clutch under pressure. The Habs have already gotten further than some people expected, and they were closing in on some records, even though not too many people really noticed yet. For one, the Habs, like I mentioned, had now won 8 playoff games in a row in one playoff year. The record is 11, shared by the Chicago Blackhawks and Pittsburgh Penguins from the prior year in 1992. As you can see, many teams were tied at 8 straight. But the record they were closest to was consecutive overtime wins in a single playoff, as the record was 6, held by the 1979-80 New York Islanders. And you can see on the list there's another team this playoff year with a streak going of its own with 4 overtime wins consecutively. And it's once again an unlikely team that the Habs will be facing for the Wales Conference Final, the New York Islanders, who finished with a good 87 points, pulled off a minor upset over the Washington Capitals, a series that's famous for resident knuckle-dragger Dale Hunter performing a violent, dirty cross-check to Pierre Turgeon after he scored a goal in the 6th and deciding game, taking him out of action, resulting in, at that time, the biggest suspension in NHL history. The Islanders, however, still bolstered a very talented team. Ray Ferraro, Steve Thomas, Derek King, and Benoit Hogue all up front. On defense, you had veteran Uwe Krupp and rookie Vladimir Malakhov, and in net, the highly talented Glenn Healy. But they were up against the Pittsburgh Penguins, a team that had a storied year from Lemieux's comeback from cancer to win the scoring title and league MVP, as a team had also won 17 straight games, setting an NHL record. No chance. No way without their best player. But the Islanders, however, surprisingly found a way to take it all the way to Game 7. And while Turgeon returned for that game, he didn't see much ice time or even get a shot on goal, so the Isles still did it pretty much without him, as they won it in epic fashion in overtime, one of the biggest upsets to this day in playoff history. So the Habs already triumphed over one team who dominated their first place division winner, while now they have to face a team who did the unthinkable, as Isles fans and many hockey experts were saying that the Islanders could full well win this thing and make it all the way to the finals. Game 1 is also to take place at the Montreal Forum on May 16th. Pierre Turgeon, however, sits this one out, while the Habs' Matthew Schneider returns to the lineup after just playing one game all playoff season, as does Stéphane Lebeau, who hasn't been seen much since the Quebec series either. And Montreal's defense plays a huge game, and opening the scoring midway through the first period is Gilbert Dion, as the Habs keep that 1-0 lead after the first period. Early in the second, John Leclerc scores his first of the playoffs, and it's now 2-0. Later in the period in the power play, Brian Bellows scores. Both second period goals were assisted by Eric Desjardins, who's really shining in these playoffs. It's 3-0 after 2 periods. The Islanders have no answer for the Habs on this day, and Leclerc scores his second of the game in the third period to make it 4-0. But with 1:07 to play, red-hot Ray Ferraro, who has been a beast in these playoffs, breaks Walsh shut up bit, but that's all she wrote. Montreal takes the first game by a score of 4-1 to extend their playoff winning streak to 9. Leclerc, like he has all seasons, breaks out when you least expect it, and Montreal's defensive core played a very tight game this go-round. Desjardins plays another beauty, while Kevin Haller continues to shine as well, as the momentum continues for the Habs. For Game 2, Pierre Turgeon returns to the lineup for the Islanders, and he makes a big return as he opens up the scoring of the game. Nearly 14 minutes in, the Islanders take that 1-0 lead into the second period. However, Brian Bellows scores in the second period, and not long after so does Lebeau, scoring his first goal of the playoffs. And just like that, Montreal leads 2-1, and that's how it would stay after 2 periods. Waugh and Healy were both making big saves so far in this tight-knit game, but midway through the second period, Steve Thomas scores to tie it, and just over 2 minutes later, David Volek scores, the overtime hero from the Pittsburgh series, to give them a 3-2 lead. But again, just over 2 minutes later, Paul DiPietro scores, and the game is tied 3-3, and we're headed to overtime. Waugh and Healy are again called upon to keep the game going, as don't forget the Isles have also won 4 straight overtime games. So both teams know how to work hard on that clutch, and again, Waugh and Healy in this time and era were 2 guys you'd probably want in your net. The first overtime goes on and on and on, and we have no decision. Now we go to double overtime, and just 6 minutes in, Lebeau scores the goal of his career that sends the Forum into jubilation as Montreal takes both games at home, where they have yet to lose this playoff year and tie the New York Islanders' 1980 record of 6 straight overtime wins in a playoff year, and have now won 10 straight playoff games, approaching that record of 11. It was an exciting game once again. Waugh and the Habs provide a great clutch play that has paid dividends. For Game 3, the series shifts to the Island, and Waugh is again showing off some great heroics. And the Islanders' defense are the ones that come to play the big game as well. So much so there's no scoring in the first period thanks to good goaltending and good defense. In the second period, Turgeon scores just over a minute in, and the Habs can't get any momentum going in front, and it stays 1-0 until the end of the second period. In the third, they still can't muster up much of attack. The defense is playing very well. Waugh is making some big saves, and finally someone responds. It's a man who's been playing well but relatively quiet this series, and that is Vincent Dongfu scoring. 5:14 to go. We're again, you guessed it, off to overtime. Waugh keeps them in it, and that's the routine. He makes those big clutch stops, and someone responds. And for the second time in these playoffs, it's Guy Carbonneau, 12 minutes in. Montreal has broken the record with 7 consecutive overtime wins and a single playoff, and have now tied the 92 Blackhawks and the 92 champion Penguins for the biggest playoff winning streak in one playoff year. Benoit Brunet was on fire in this game with 2 assists as Montreal was playing well collectively as a unit, as the role players are really coming through for them in the clutch. Now we're off to Game 4 as the Habs are just 1 win away from yet another clean sweep and making it to the Stanley Cup Finals, and also breaking the playoff record for a winning streak. The first period of Montreal's defensive game is up and running in full, and Waugh makes a couple big saves, but the Isles' defensive scheme is also in full effect as they try to avoid this sweep. The first period remains scoreless going into the second, but just over 6 minutes into the second, Paul DiPietro scores, and it's 1-0 Habs. Several minutes later, however, Steve Thomas ties the game for the Islanders, and we have another tight-knit game going into the second period. But then Pat Flatley, the veteran, scores gives the Isles a 2-1 lead less than 5 minutes later. However, Dave Volek scores to give them a 2-goal lead. The Habs can't get any momentum going and haven't looked this bad since Game 2 against the Nordiques in the opening round. Last time they lost any playoff game. And the Isles iced the game with an empty netter from Benoit Hoga. Huge 4-1 win for the Islanders, staving off elimination and stalling the Habs' chance for setting a playoff record. The Islanders shut down the Habs in all facets of the game, and UA Krupp played a beauty, led the Isles defense to a huge game and a big team effort. The Habs boobers and the media, however, come out yet again as Kirk Muller has 1 assist in the whole series. Even Dawfus and Bellows are being lambasted for not showing much dominance. For God's sakes, people, it's one game heading back to Montreal. Despite this, the Habs still share a record that stands today of 11 straight playoff game wins in a season. The closest anyone has come since then is the 2008 Detroit Red Wings with 9, while several others have reached 8 since then. We're back in Montreal for Game 5, and just under a minute in, Kirk Muller scores his first goal of the series. Well, how do you like that? The Habs are playing yet another tight game in Oise, making those difficult stops. And late in the period, Mike Keane scores, and it's 2-0 Montreal after 1. Less than 2 minutes into the second period, Dawfus makes it 3-0. And the Habs play a very defensive game in that period. And J.J. Daigneault gets his first goal of the playoffs. It's 4-0. 9 seconds later, Bellows scores. 43 seconds later, it's Steve Thomas who finally puts the Islanders on the board, but it's 5-1 for Montreal after 2 periods. And while Benoit Hogue scored in the third period to put the Islanders within 3 goals, that was not nearly enough. And Montreal holds on for the epic 5-2 win and a berth in the Stanley Cup Finals for the 3rd time in 8 seasons. The big guns responded huge to their criticism as Bellows, Muller, and Dawfus all played great, while Keenan and Leclerc were also ever present in this clincher. Waugh was excellent in the net, and for the 32nd time in their history, we're headed to the big dance, the Stanley Cup Finals. Despite their criticisms, Vincent Dawfus again leads the way among scorers with 6 points, while Bellows follows closely behind with 5, and John Leclerc, showing a scoring touch that was rare at that time, adds 4. Matthew Schneider's return to the lineup gave the Habs a huge boost as their defense again was on point, and journeyman defenseman J.J. Daigneault came up big for the team as well, leading all defensemen in this series, while Desjardins and Odeline still also produced a heavy presence. Patrick Waugh was sensational, a very large 9.32 save percentage and a 1.78 goals against average. This is the Waugh we normally see, as his troubles throughout the regular season are disintegrating in these playoffs. It's fitting that this season, being the 100th anniversary of the Stanley Cup, will feature the team that has had the most successful history with it. At this time, the team had won 23, their last being in 1986 at that point. But who was awaiting them in this huge series? It would be a team that, yet again, nobody expected to be there, but again, made an improbable run through the opposition. It would be the Los Angeles Kings. The team is led, of course, by the great Wayne Gretzky, who is joined by other All-Stars such as Luc Robitaille, longtime collaborator Yari Kuri, as well as Thomas Sandstrom and Tony Granato. On the blue line, it's a core that features 2 longtime teammates of Gretzky, Charlie Huddy and Marty McSorley, as well as up-and-coming youngsters Rob Blake and Daryl Sador. And in goal, the sensational Kelly Hrudey. In the first round, the Kings pulled off an upset over the Calgary Flames in just 6 games, then scored what's probably the second biggest upset of these playoffs, beating the Vancouver Canucks also in 6 games. And then came the epic series against the Toronto Maple Leafs, and blah blah blah. Leafs win Game 5 to take series lead, yada yada yada, high stick. Leaf fans whine about it for the next 29 years. They lose Game 6, and Gretzky plays a game of his life in Game 7, and they're off to the finals for the very first time. Gretzky looks for his 5th cup ring, his first since 1988, and his first as a King. It's fitting that the Stanley Cup Final will feature hockey's most celebrated team and its most celebrated player. While Montreal was the favorite going into this final, they weren't what you'd call heavy favorites, as some out there believed that the Habs' lack of high-scoring prowess would come back to bite them, as LA was a very high-scoring team. As a matter of fact, going into the finals, the Habs didn't have a scorer in the top 5. They had Vincent Dawfus just outside of that. But it showed the Habs' cohesiveness as a club. When it came down to goals, the Habs were averaging 3.4 goals a game, but the Kings, however, were averaging 4.3 goals a game, so the odds makers, maybe they're onto something. However, on the other side of the coin, Montreal's only allowed an average of 2.6 goals a game, whereas the Kings have allowed an even 4 goals a game thus far. So the Habs' key will be their defensive strategy and clutch goaltending. as we head in to Game 1. Game 1, set on June 1st, 1993. Muller in his 9th season, Dawfus in his 7th, Bellows in his 11th, and Savard in his 13th. All look for that first Stanley Cup ring and their first time getting their names engraved on the cup. On the Kings, you have longtime veteran leader Dave Taylor in his 16th season is also looking to get his name on the cup for the very first time. On the Habs, you also have a combined, 2 cup rings. 3 if you count Rob Ramage, however, he doesn't play in this series. But the ones I'm zeroing in on are Patrick Roy and Guy Carbonneau, both there in '86. Yet on the Kings, you have a combined 16 between the former Oilers alumni of Gretzky, Curry, Huddy, and McSorley. So much is at stake. Game 1, the fans are hot, but a holding penalty from Lyle Oderline puts the Kings on a power play early on. And Luc Robitaille makes them pay with a goal early in the frame to make it 1-0 Kings, putting them on the board first in these finals. The Habs get big chances, but Kelly Hrudey turns them all away, as Waugh is also bombarded. As a matter of fact, it takes an unlikely costly mistake by Gretzky, which results in putting the puck into his own net? And that indeed ties the game, as Ed Ronan gets credit for the goal, as the Montreal fans thank Gretzky with an ever-loving chant of his name, and it's 1-1 after 1 period. Both Hrudey and Waugh are sharp in the second period, but again it's Luc Robitaille on the power play who makes the Habs pay for their mistakes, and the Kings lead 2-1 after 2. Montreal is not playing very aggressive or sticking to their defensive-minded strategies, puzzlingly. In the third period, it does not get any better, as the most lethal combo in playoff, and perhaps in general NHL history, strike again. Gretzky to Curry, and the Kings now have a nice 3-1 lead early in the third period. Try as they might, the Habs cannot get a thing going, and are not playing overly aggressive, whereas the Kings actually edge them out on that aspect. It's important to note that Mike Keane, however, is not dressed for this game, and it's clearly showing. Gretzky notches an empty netter with just under 2 minutes to play, and mark it down a shocking 4-1 victory for the Kings. It was a brutal night for the Habs. While Waugh made some big saves, his defense did let him down and out to dry in many ways. Robitaille and Gretzky decimated the Habs, as Gretzky was in on all goals, even Montreal's only goal, for crying out loud. Hrudey was amazing in net, but now Montreal loses their first playoff game at home this season, as LA's system seems to be working for them. Shortly after the game, Patrick Roy's wife at the time, Michelle, went into labor and gave birth to a baby girl, their third child together, and first daughter, Jana. Waugh, who was quite superstitious and eccentric like many goalies at this time, perhaps saw this as a good luck charm, as it took his mind off the game and helped focus his energy elsewhere. But Game 2 was all set, however, soon after on June the 3rd, and the once again proud Papa remained focused as his team hit the ice. They tried to avoid going down 2 games and not heading to LA. Mike Keane also returned to the lineup, but Denny Savard would be out for the remainder of the finals, but would take on a key assistant coaching role. The Habs came out hitting hard in the first period, going after Gretzky and other top forwards. Keane also had Yari Curry's number on that night particularly. Hrudey, however, was amazing in net, and Montreal couldn't seem to solve him whatsoever. That wasn't until 1:29 to play in the period as Eric Desjardins scored, and Montreal had their first lead of the series. Montreal was playing very well defensively in this game, giving Waugh a lot of breathing space, as the team did lead 1-0 going into the second period, but Dave Taylor, one of the all-time greats in King history, scored a big shorthanded goal early on in the second to tie it at 1-1. Hrudey continued to give the Habs a hard time, and it was 1-1 after 2 periods. And again, he was a wall in the third as well, but just over 8.5 minutes in, Pat Conacher scored to make it 2-1 Kings on a setup from Dave Taylor, who was having a huge game. The Habs were in deep trouble. Jacques Demers needed to turn the tide in a huge way for his team. With just 1:45 to play, he called for a stick measurement on Marty McSorley's blade of his stick. If the Habs win the challenge, they get a power play. If they lose, they go down a man themselves. After the measurement took place, it was deemed illegal, and the Habs were about to go on a power play. And they would be able to pull Patrick Roy for an extra attacker. They'd have 6 skaters on 4. It was perhaps the most memorable moment of these playoffs and could be a potential game changer. On the power play, the Habs piled on the pressure, and with just 1:13 to go, Desjardins gets his second goal of the game. As the form erupts in joy and the game is tied at 2, and yes, we're headed to overtime. It does not even take a minute, as Montreal has all the momentum, and Eric Desjardins becomes the first defenseman in history to score a hat-trick in the finals, and to date, the only one. Yes, another record for the Habs this playoff season. Desjardins played the game of his life, and the Habs came out more aggressive in this particular outing as well. Their checking line held Gretzky, Curry, and Robitaille off the score sheet, but of course, the illegal stick comes into question, and it's still a topic for debate to this day. There are many theories about how it happened, from McSorley himself claiming Montreal staff had measured the sticks beforehand. Longtime Habs trainer Gaetan Lefebvre had them in the Habs locker room, the whole rack. Hab Gary Lehman also later claimed as well that very same thing. Luc Robitaille even claimed a Montreal policeman working the forum told him about a year later that he was told to leave his post between periods so the Habs could measure players' sticks. That one seems a little unlikely. However, the way the Habs remember it is that Guy Carbonneau, who did have an eye for these sort of details of the game, noticed the curves of these sticks while going into face-offs. And apparently Coach Jacques Demers asked Carbonneau if they should call it. The truth is probably somewhere in between any of these stories, but the fact remains, as Marty McSorley and former coach Barry Melrose still bitch about it nearly 30 years later, you shouldn't have played with an illegal stick, you knuckle-dragging cement head. In the end, the Habs tie the series. The series shifts to LA for Game 3 and tied 1-1, both teams focused on what they need to improve on. The Kings need to give Rudy some breathing room, and while Vincent Dawfus played well in Game 2, other big guns such as Mullers and Bellows have been held pointless, especially Bellows, once again being criticized heavily for his play thus far in the finals. The stars are out tonight, as Hollywood bigwigs such as Family Guy cast member James Woods, super couple Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell, as well as a late great John Candy, are in attendance. In the last 5 years, Gretzky has been the one to make hockey fashionable in LA, but the red carpet party wouldn't be one to get too excited about, as Rudy is again amazing in net, as is Waugh this time, as the Kings are pressuring him more than they did in Game 2. But on the power play midway through the frame, Brian Bellows gets his first goal of the finals, a very bizarre goal, tipping in a Kevin Haller shot, and it's 1-0 Montreal, and that's how it would stay after one period. Really in the second period, Gilbert Dion scores, and then 21 seconds later, so does Matthew Schneider, his first of the playoffs, and it's 3-0 for the Habs. But the Kings' top guns come out shooting as Robitaille is set up by Gretzky, and the Kings are on the board. Just over 3 minutes later, Tony Granato makes a great individual effort, and the Kings are within a goal. And late in the frame, Gretzky had only had one shot on goal and was pointless in Game 2, scored to tie the game as Montreal lets a huge lead slip away. In the same period, they obtained it. In the third period, Juan and Rudy have a superb goaltending showdown, and guess what? We're headed to OT. Yeah, LA, you're screwed. It only takes 34 seconds, and this time the hero is John Leclerc, as he's out there with Muller and Bellows, who are both in on the goal, and Montreal wins it 4-3 and takes a 2-1 series lead. Well, Bellows and Muller at last had delivered and played excellently, while Waugh, of course, did his thing in net, while Leclerc got to be the hero in overtime. The Kings are still getting a lot from Gretzky and Robitaille, but Sandstrom hasn't really been on the same pace he has been all playoffs, and Curry has been non-existent in these last two games. Now it's the Kings with their backs against the wall, need to desperately tie the series before they head back to Montreal. Game 4 in LA, they're confident they can still win this thing, and again, both goalies are proving their value to their respective teams in this showdown, but the Habs get on the board first yet again for the third consecutive game. Kirk Muller makes a good individual effort to score his first goal of the finals. Waugh keeps things at bay, and it remains 1-0 after one. Vincent Dongfu again gets his first goal of the finals as well, and a power play. Just over 5 minutes into the second period, it's 2-0 Habs. But just over a minute later, Mike Donnelly scores, and the Habs lead is cut in half. And then with 5 seconds left in the second period, the Kings score on a power play. McSorley scores, admitting to likely using an illegal stick again during this game several years later in an interview, but because it's okay, it's not like I took a torch to it. And we're tied 2-2 to end the second period. The goalies are again showcasing their abilities in the third period, but if there's one incident more infamous than the illegal stick in this series, it's what took place with about a minute left in regulation. Patrick Waugh had made a save on a Luc Robitaille attempt that likely saved the game for the Habs. Thomas Sandstrom was looking for a rebound opportunity that never really came. And how amazing is it that the cameras caught it? As Sandstrom skates by, a close-up on Waugh's face shows him giving him a little wink. Haha, Sandstrom had been struggling the entire series, and it's pretty much Waugh saying, as good as you may be, you'll never score on me. So again, we're headed to overtime, and this time the Habs, however, can ice it right away, but Waugh, like he does, is living up to his vow that he made in the first round, refused to letting an overtime goal in. With a big individual effort, John Leclerc is the hero for the second game in a row, and now the Habs have a commanding 3-1 series lead as they head back home on the verge of a championship. Again, it's the Habs' cohesiveness as a team, bolstered by the clutch goaltending of their star goalie, which brings them to the edge of glory again. And now 10 straight overtime wins. Sandstrom and Curry are again nowhere to be found. So now, here we go, back in Montreal for Game 5. Their chance to win their 24th Stanley Cup, but the Kings have proven they can win at the Forum. And Gretzky plays well on the verge of dire situations. We saw that in the Maple Leafs series in the conference final. And the fans are excited as the atmosphere on the Forum is absolutely electric. The fans are going ape for the team and in this game. And the Habs defense is the ones who come to play big today. Their core at the blue line and even up front gives the Kings forwards a lot of headaches the whole way through. Rudy is again looking pretty good in net, but the Habs get on board first as Paul DiPietro, who've been quiet in this series, puts them on the board with just under 5 minutes to go in the first period. It's 1-0 after 1. But the Kings show no quit, as while Gretzky, Curry, Sandstrom, Granato, and Robitaille are having trouble getting anything going, Robitaille does eventually break through and help assist along with Jimmy Carson on another Marty the Cheater McSorley's goal, and the game is now tied early in the second period. But Dongfu sets up Muller, and Montreal takes the lead back 2-1. Just past the midway point of the period, Stéphane Lebeau, who has also been quiet for most of these playoffs, outside of his big game against the Islanders in Game 2 of the conference finals, scores to make it 3-1 Montreal after 2. Gretzky, Curry, and Sandstrom can't even get a shot on goal. The Montreal defense is making it difficult for the Kings, as Watt does have to make some saves, but he's not having the long night he's used to in these playoffs. The Kings are working hard to their credit, but it's not enough as Paul DiPietro scores his second goal of the game, 12:06 into the third period. 4-1 Montreal. The Kings, they just run out of gas, and the clock ticks down. 3, 2, 1-0. The Montreal Canadiens win their 24th Stanley Cup. A big night from DiPietro as well as the Habs defense. As Gretzky, Sandstrom, and Curry can't even fire off a single shot on Patrick Waugh the entire game, leaving Luc Robitaille to carry a heavy load. In a season that was supposed to be just another good year for the Habs, it ends with the biggest prize in the game. It was a collaborative team effort from the Habs in a huge way, as the scoring was shared amongst the players, something that gave them the advantage in the end. Desjardins was amazing in Game 2. Leclerc with those 2 OT winners back-to-back in Games 3 and 4, plus 2 assists in the deciding game, made him a huge hero of this series. Muller, after a slow start, picked it up in the final 3 games, and Dongfu again, living up to his captain consistency moniker, was by far the Habs' best forward in these playoffs as well. Of course, this means Eric Desjardins led all defensemen in scoring, and Brian Bellows led the team with a +4 rating. Again, here's a guy who's never had a good plus-minus rating in his entire career. And while he didn't rack up a huge deal of points in these finals, he was still a welcome presence on the ice, especially in Games 3 and 4. And overall, he did have a good playoff year. And that brings us to Patrick Waugh. What an amazing finals. A .929 save percentage, 2.10 goals against average. In the clutch, he gave the Habs everything they needed. The Montreal Canadiens of 1992-93 Stanley Cup champions, Jacques Demers, in his first year of coaching the club, did what he came here to do. At long last, Denis Savard, the future Hall of Famer, was able to hoist the Stanley Cup, get himself a ring, and his name engraved on the biggest prize in all of professional hockey. For Vincent Dawfus, Kirk Muller, and Brian Bellows, they reached the top of the mountain at long last, which would be the first and only time in their careers. However, the latter two would play in the Cup Finals with different teams later on. Guy Carbonneau, despite a rough year, provided the leadership and came up in the clutch like many of his teammates. However, he'd only spend one more year with the club. After nearly 15 years of being associated with them, would depart for St. Louis, but then found his second home in Dallas, where he'd win one more Stanley Cup on his way to the Hall of Fame as well. This Habs team would be severely different in just 2.5 years. Bad management and decisions combined with inconsistency on the ice led to all the disintegration of this team. By New Year's Day 1996, Carbonneau, Savard, Keane, Bellows, Muller, Leclerc, Desjardins, Dion, Schneider, and even Waugh were gone. But be that as it may, the glory of this cup win is something to truly behold as we take a look at the final numbers. In terms of scoring, Vincent Dawfus led the way, and while the media criticized the likes of Muller and Bellows for their play, Captain Kirk was one of the best clutch players of these playoffs, with 2 overtime goals to prove it. All the while, Bellows, his scoring production did drift off a bit in the finals. He played big in quite a few games, especially in the opening round, as well as his return in the Buffalo series, and looked very good in the Islanders series to boot. He led all plus-minus in the finals. And in my opinion, the man who is the unsung hero of these playoffs, Mike Keane, was outstanding in his own right, providing huge defensive skills up front to the team, making sure to contain top forwards on any given opponent in these playoffs. Keane was an underrated asset to the Habs' entire tenure there. Dongfu did what he came there to do, and therefore he was 4th in overall playoff scoring. And as you can see, 3 LA players are on there and only 1 Habs player. It just goes to show you how together this team was from top to bottom for production, more so than the Kings. You had guys like Gilbert Dion stepping up in big games, guys like Paul DiPietro, you name it, John Leclerc. These guys were up for the task when they were called upon to do so. Mike Keane was a very impressive +10 in these playoffs, but we cannot emphasize enough how he and Carbonneau led a checking crew that completely shut down Yari Curry and Thomas Sanson the whole series. Also, Matthew Schneider was a +10, made all the more impressive that he only returned in the conference finals and only played 11 games the entire playoffs. Eric Desjardins led all the defensemen in the playoffs, and of course the team, with 14 points, including his epic game-saving and, dare we say, series-saving performance in Game 2. Keane and Schneider's +10 was tied for 3rd best in the playoffs to boot. Desjardins, again, was a monster in these playoffs, and we also have to give credit to Lyle Odeline for coming up big in certain games and situations as well. And lastly, the Conn Smythe Trophy winner for playoff MVP is... Patrick Waugh! Oh yes, the numbers say a lot. 16-4, 2.13 goals against average, .929 save percentage, but above all that, provided a style of clutch goaltending that has been very seldom seen in any playoff year since. He shook off his wonky regular season, was sensational in dire situations, and this, his 2nd Conn Smythe Trophy. His first was in 1986, his rookie year, when he and a large group of fellow rookies and longtime vets from the Habs glory days, as well as a couple scoring all-stars, came together and won it all. And oh yes, Guy Carbonneau was there as well. For both Waugh and Carbonneau, their 2nd Stanley Cup rings. Well, folks, that'll do it for our look at the 1992-93 Montreal Canadiens, a team that brought a whole new definition to clutch playoff play. Which team would you like to see me cover next in an entire Anatomy of a Season series? Leave a comment below to make suggestions. In the meantime, hit like, subscribe to the channel, but until next time, I'll see ya!